Really great to see so many people joining us for the webinar today. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I direct the China Center here at the University of Minnesota. And I thank you for supporting and joining our Considering China webinar with Professor Yawei Liu. There will be a Q&A directly following the presentation, so please submit your questions that you may have throughout the program at the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many of the questions as possible at the end of the program. In September, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Carter Center conducted new polling that offers a rare window into how Chinese citizens view China's global role and foreign policy. Professor Liu will discuss the findings in his presentation today. The world according to the Chinese people, how they see the U.S. and their own future will impact global peace and prosperity. Professor Yawei Liu is a senior advisor on China at the Carter Center and an adjunct professor of political science at Emory University in Georgia. He's an expert on U.S.-China relations, Chinese grassroots democracy. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and associate director of the China Research Center in Atlanta. Involved with the Carter Center for over 25 years, Dr. Liu has been a member of numerous Carter Center missions to observe and monitor global elections, and he has written extensively on China's political developments and grassroots democracy. He's also the founding editor of the China Elections and Governance website and co-author of the popular Chinese book, Obama, The Man Who Will Change America. At the Carter Center, Dr. Liu directs the center's China Focus. He's the chief editor of the center's U.S.-China Perception Monitor, which is published both in Mandarin and English. He also publishes the center's Finding Firmer Ground report series, which explores how dialogue, conflict management, and collaboration between the U.S. and China can sustain peace and prosperity throughout East Asia. So welcome, Dr. Liu.
Thanks, Joe and Haiyan, for organizing this event. Thank you also for the generous introduction. Thank everyone who are signing in. The Central Time is noon time, but here is 1 o'clock. Today is October the 1st. Happens to be both the National Day for People's Republic of China, as well as the birthday of President Carter. It's also so sad to see that the federal government shuts down on this very meaningful day. So today I will talk about not just the survey findings of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Carter Center, but also findings from other institutions that are here in the US, in Canada, as well as in China. But I will start a few slides on the view of the leaders of China, and their views certainly have a huge impact on where the country was going to be on, in the Chinese way, we always say your decision will impact the fate of the country, 影响国家的命运，影响国运。So the first event I want to cite is exactly 100 years before Mao Zedong was born. The British diplomat George Macartney, became a special envoy for the British king, and he traveled to China. He wanted to establish a British embassy there and to have normal and regular trade with Qing dynasty. You see the picture of him kneeling down in front of Qianlong, the emperor. They spent days talking about how the two are going to meet with each other. In any case, Qianlong told the British King George III, I see no value on objects strange or ingenious and have no use of your country's manufactures. Basically, his view of the Qing dynasty of China at that time is we're the Middle Kingdom, we're self-sufficient, we don't need anything from the outside. So when Westerners wanted to open the door, the Chinese authority at the time shut the door airtight. And that led to the Opium War, which eventually led to the so-called century of humiliation. And the Chinese view, the people's view, are continued continuously impacted by the so-called century of humiliation. Now we're moving to Mao himself. So his view of the U.S. Change. I actually wrote my dissertation on Mao's view of China. It's called "The United States According to Mao Zedong." So each and every time Mao's view of the U.S. changed, it had a huge impact on his decision making, which is, of course, China's policy toward the United States. So of course, in 1945, there was the Dixie mission in Yan, and Mao talked to American Army observers all the time, and he had a very positive view of that, and he was seeking American recognition of China. But of course, that recognition never came. Fast forwarding to 1968, when MLK, a native from Atlanta, was assassinated, Mao wrote editorial for the People's Daily, and he basically said the days of the U.S. government that was controlled by Wall Street firms are numbered. And you see his statement here on the right side of the slide, Mao's statement, as well as a map of where all the riots took place after King's assassination. And of course, we all know in 1972, President Nixon visited China because Mao's view changed. Again, he felt Moscow posed a bigger threat, and U.S. Was a potential friend, and then the policy quickly changed. And then, of course, President Jimmy Carter and Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping negotiated, and then the relationship was finalized on January the 1st. Relationship was normalized on January the 1st, 1979. And shortly after that, Deng made a historic visit to the United States. On his way to the U.S., Li Shenzhi, who was the director of Institute of American Studies of CAS, he asked Deng why you pay so much attention to the U.S. And Deng said, looking back in the past several decades, all those countries that have a good relationship with the United States have become wealthy. So in a sense, Deng thinks U.S. is the source of capital, U.S. is the source of technology, U.S. is the source of market where Chinese can sell their manufacturers. And because of this seismic change in his view of the U.S., the relationship between these two countries were finally normalized. Now we're coming to the current paramount leader of China, Xi Jinping. In fact, in March 2023, he, for the first time, I think maybe the only time, at least publicly, he named the country that has caused the unprecedented acute difficulties for China. He basically told the delegates to the National People's Congress, as well as delegates to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, that Western nations led by the US have implemented comprehensive containment, encirclement, and pressure on China, therefore causing problems for China's development. We have to think about this frustration in the context of all his meetings with leaders of the U.S. He obviously sees this relationship as the most important one, and we can appreciate his frustration because that's exactly what American leaders, what American members of Congress are talking about every day. That is to contain China. I think President Biden famously said during his first press conference in 2021, China becoming a military, economic, and political power, that's not going to happen under his watch. All right, now moving on to what I want to share with you, the findings from these public opinion polls. So the Carter Center and the Chicago Council are not the only one that are doing this. So today I will also share some of the findings by the China Institute of the Alberta University of Alberta in Canada, as well as Tsinghua University's Center on International Security and Strategy. In passing, I'll also talk about the Asian Barometer survey that was largely organized and chaired by Dr. Zhu Yinghan, who actually received his PhD from University of Minnesota, which is the organizer of today's presentation. So the first question is, how do Chinese people see their country in the world? If you look at this chart, the impression from looking at this is majority of the Chinese people believe their country is the most powerful, most influential country in the world. So here is the Chicago finding, now and in the next 5 years. And here at the bottom left is the funding from the University of Alberta. If you look at the chart on the right, it is in Chinese, but it's very easy to see because 5 represents the most influential and 1 the least influential. So if you look at this chart, it's very interesting. You see at the bottom there's the blue, there's the green. The green represents the findings of last year, and the blue represents the findings of 2023. Interestingly, in 2024, Chinese people see the United States as the most influential. So that number is 4.6 out of 5, and China is the second most influential. So there is a little change from the findings in China by Tsinghua University. But overall, I think we can draw the conclusion the Chinese people are very confident and they are totally convinced that China is, if not the most influential, it is one of the most influential countries in the world. So that's the first major finding from multiple surveys. The second is, this is also very interesting. To many of you, this may not be a new story. However, the number, when you look at it, is shocking. So if you look at on the right side, this is the Chicago Carter Center finding, is 83% of the Chinese say Russia is a friend of China. 76% say North Korea is a friend of China. Only 17% of the Chinese say the US is a friend. US and Japan in multiple uh, opinion surveys are always the last 2 countries. They are at the bottom. Now the left side is the finding by the Tsinghua University CISS. So if you look at this again, you see the variation of 23 and 24. Again, Russia is 3.67 this year, last year, and 3.66 out of 5. The 5 most positive view of a particular country. And the United States this year is at a poorly pitiful at 1.85, and last year it was slightly higher at 2.19. University of Alberta finding is more or less the same. Russia remains its status as China's most trusted strategic partner. 74% of the Chinese people think that that's the way. Now, the U.S., I think it occupies a very central and core place in the Chinese people's mind. So over here, I want to go back to 17 years ago, in 2008, when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympic Games. So this survey was conducted by Institute of American Studies, as I mentioned earlier. So Chinese trust in Russia did not start recently. It started way back. So in 2008, 53% of the Chinese people had a very positive view or positive view of Russia. Only 27.5% of the people had similar view toward the US, but it's still relatively high. Right now, it's only 17%, but 17 years ago, it's at 27%. In terms of the level of influence of global affairs, United States back then obviously was the most influential. 65.5% felt the US was most powerful. And the Chinese people are very sensitive to the fact that even though they can trust Russia, but Russia's impact on the US, on the world affairs is very marginal. Only 16% assigned Russia as the most influential nation in the world. So here, what I mean by the centrality of US in the mind of the Chinese people. So I think when I say centrality, is the Chinese people believe US is the most powerful. They also believe US can make China prosperous. It can create a very peaceful environment for China. But at the same time, majority of the Chinese people seem to believe US has a very authorial design on China. So if you look at the finding from Tsinghua University, at the bottom you see my translation, US goal toward an influence on China. So 87% of the Chinese people believe US wants to contain China. This is the second one is actually very interesting. It used to be on top of the Chinese concerns in terms of US purpose on China is peaceful evolution. The US actually wants to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party and want to weaken the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And then US not seeking to have war with China. 40% of the Chinese people believe US is not seeking war, which I think is a source of comfort to some extent. Now, on the top right, which is interesting, when basically the question is, regardless of how you feel about the US, how big is the US impact on China's economic development? 93% of the Chinese people believe US has impact on China's economy. But that's how heavy, the Chinese people, heavy-heartedness of the Chinese people when they think about the US. And then the two biggest threats to Chinese domestic stability, according to the Tsinghua survey, is number one, US economic policies, 46%, and number two, US military power and global allies, it's 34.5%. But there is a clear distinction when you ask the Chinese people, whether they have trust in the US, whether they have negative view of the US, what they have is USG, US government. So over here, you see it's across the age, across education, across gender, and across the whole cross section of the Chinese population. They have no trust in the US. However, if you ask how do they feel about the American people, 81% of the Chinese people hold negative view of the US government, but 85% of the same group of people hold neutral or positive view of the American people. So there is a clear distinction between what the US government is trying to do to China and how Chinese people feel about American people. Again, to the Chinese people, US government poses the biggest threat to China. So this is the first slide on my PowerPoint today. possible threats to China. If you look at the top two, one is possible conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan. That's 57%. And then the second is economic competition between China and the United States. I think the Chinese people are clear-minded or clear-eyed about what kind of threat U.S. poses. Now, the Tsinghua poll basically lists the tension between U.S. and China, the Chinese and China, the relationship between the two countries. That's 3 out of 5. And the second one is international involvement in Taiwan issue. Again, when you talk about the internationalization of the Taiwan issue, it mostly means the Taiwan Relations Act and a continuous U.S. commitment to define Taiwan. The University of Alberta survey basically asked the Chinese people which country you think is most likely to have a military conflict with China. So over here you see U.S. Certainly is 45%. And then the next one is Japan at 35%. And then India is at 15%. So this is how, when you talk about China, this is how Chinese people feel about that gathering threat posed by U.S. to China as a nation, and of course to them as a people. However, I want to mention that to the Chinese people, U.S.-China cooperation is not unthinkable. So here, I sort of compare the two surveys. The one that I mentioned earlier that was conducted by Institute of American Studies in 2008, and the one that was conducted by Tsinghua last year in 2024. So here in 2008, 47% of the Chinese people felt optimistic or very optimistic about the bilateral relations. I don't think that's the case anymore, even though the Tsinghua survey last year found that many Chinese people are still hopeful that this relationship is going to improve. Now, if you look at where Chinese people believe the US and China can join hands, can cooperate, or can at least coordinate their policies. So this comparison is very interesting. So back in 2008, on trade and economy is 47%. Now, in 2024, it's 56%. Now, in 2008, the Chinese people still believe the US and China can work together to resolve the Taiwan issue. It's no longer an option in 2024. Now, environmental protection is another very interesting finding here. In 2008, only 16%, but in 2024, 51%. So here, environmental is always closely connected to climate change. So Chinese people firmly believe US and China can make a big difference in slowing down the climate change if the two countries are going to work together. Education is another interesting finding. So back in 2008, only about 6% of the Chinese think US and China can work together. But in 2024, that number has become close to 50%, even though U.S. has done a whole lot to disrupt educational and cultural exchanges between the two countries. In 2024, still close to 50% of the Chinese people think this is an area where they would like to see closer cooperation between the two countries. Nuclear non-proliferation in 2008 is not an option, but now it's 53, almost 54%. Again, public health because of the pandemic, so 32% believe they can work together. Human rights is very interesting. There's very little change on the human rights. In 2008, it's 16%, and in last year, it's 14%. But with Trump in office, I think human rights is going to become less and less a concern of the USG toward China. Taiwan obviously is very important to the Chinese people. However, if you look at the findings, it's very interesting because we tend to believe Chinese people are very much united, that Taiwan will have to come back. If peaceful means doesn't work, they're not reluctant to use force, or at least they're going to support the decision of the Chinese leaders to use force. So our survey, when I say our survey, is the Chicago Council and the Carter uh, Center survey, is 91% of the Chinese people believe people on the island of Taiwan are friends of China. So they see them as compatriots. But to look at the government, even though the government is controlled now by a pro-independence government, only 55% of the Chinese people. It's a small majority of the Chinese people believe the government on the island of Taiwan is leading the country astray. But still, 44% of the Chinese people believe, it is a friendly government. Now, this is our finding. The Carter Center alone, we conduct a survey that we call China Pulse. Its methodology is different from our joint survey with the Chicago Council, which is a cell phone. Our survey, the China Post, is an online survey. So last year's survey find out that 51, again, a small majority of the Chinese people believe Taiwan should come back to China via peaceful means. So the Taiwan problem should not be received using force under any circumstances. This is 51%. However, if you ask the question in a different way, which is this chart shows, 1 year, never, 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, then more Chinese people believe force is necessary, or at least they think using force is an option. There's a lot of citation of a recent article. So these two scholars, Adam Liu and Xiaojun Li, uh, conducted a survey of over 2,000 Chinese citizens, and their belief uh, when they conclude the findings, it's at the top very here. Over here is 31% of the Chinese population say use force if Taiwan is not coming back. So force only. Peaceful only 17%. However, a small majority of the Chinese people are actually very flexible. So to them, this issue has to be resolved, but either using force or peaceful means. So again, I think these findings has shown us something very significant behind the bamboo curtain, is that the Chinese people are not united in terms of using force to get Taiwan back. So my time is running out, so I'm going to go very quickly in the next few slides, and then we'll go to some of the conclusions. Now, the Chinese slogan is to establish 人类命运共同体, community with a shared future for mankind. So that is actually in sharp contrast of China's surrounding countries. To me, if you want to build a community with a shared future, the most important one is to build a community with your neighboring countries. However, there are only two neighboring countries that enjoy the Chinese people's trust and confidence. And the first one, of course, is Russia. So all charts shows the Chinese support for Russia. However, I do want to highlight, this is a survey we did back in late 2022, is the majority of the Chinese people prefer moral support for Russia. They don't want their country to get involved militarily. So that's why you see China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine is largely through economic means and maybe some dual use equipment, but there are no personnel involved and there are no weapons involved. So that's Russia. And then we move forward to South Korea. This is very alarming, this finding. This is the Carter Center China Pulse finding, is that a quarter to, actually, if you combine both numbers together, a small majority of the Chinese people believe if South Korea is going to develop a nuclear weapon, then China should consider using military force, 25%, and then diplomatic 26. I mean, 25% is I mean, particularly to think about intervention in South Korea. That's very alarming. And of course, North Korea. This is a very interesting case. They continue to believe stability to prevent a regime change in North Korea is in the interest of the Chinese people. Now, India, again, China's largest, in terms of population, China's largest and one of the most important neighboring countries. You see, 80% of the Chinese believe, even if it means conflict, you know, they're going to basically maintain or uphold Chinese sovereignty over the disputed territory. Again, you all remember China and India fought a war back in 1962, and there were skirmishes, and the most recent one being in 2021 during the pandemic, South China Sea. This is again very alarming. Strongly somewhat agree to strongly agree, close to 80% of the Chinese basically saying, we don't care what the international law says, we don't care what other countries are saying. South China Sea is our maritime territory. We're not going to change our position. Myanmar, this is another interesting development that majority, it's 70% of the Chinese people believe, Chinese should send peacekeepers to Myanmar if that country continue to be engulfed by civil war or conflict over there. So going to my conclusion. So this is conclusion number one. So if you look at this Chicago Council and Carter Center finding is sources of China's influence in the world. Now this is important in terms of what I mentioned earlier is this confidence or maybe overconfidence of the Chinese people of their country's comprehensive strength. However, if you look at sources of China's influence in the world, Chinese political system is not listed over here. That certainly indicates they don't think the Chinese political system is popular or should be adopted by other countries. So here I want to mention Asia Barometer survey in passing. I don't have that chart over here, but we all know from my previous sharing of the findings, the Chinese people have very little confidence in Japan. But when the Asia Barometer survey asked the question is which model of governance is most attractive to China, 43% of the people polled saying the Japan model of democracy, even though they resent Japan. And the US model is only like less than 5%. So that's very, very interesting. So here I want to highlight the point is Mao Zedong back in 1957, he traveled to Moscow. He told Chinese students they're saying the east wind will eventually prevail over the west wind, 东风压倒西风. So now this mentality seemed to be embraced by Chinese leaders. Recently, they use a different term, 东升西降, the rise of the East and the decline of the West. So this leadership perception is certainly backed up by popular perception. You don't see much daylight between the popular belief and the elite perception. So that's conclusion number one. Now, conclusion number two is it appears from multiple surveys that the majority of the Chinese people think one, globalization is beneficial for China. Two, China should remain open to the outside world. Three, Beijing should be more active on global stage. So here, by inferring from these findings, we probably can safely say Chinese people doesn't believe there should be an alternative global order. Although if you want to dissect, China should be more active on the global stage. But what areas do Chinese people want China to be more active? So if you look at the Alberta survey, so the highest one is peace and security. So here I want to highlight the gap between popular perception and the actual deeds. Just with the exception of peacekeepers, of the 5 permanent members of the United Security Council, China has the largest number of peacekeepers on the ground. But China does very little in conflict resolution or in maintaining peace anywhere in the world. So this popular perception, 70%, is in sharp contrast of Chinese government actual deeds on the global stage. There's a war in Ukraine, China doesn't do much to bring peace. There's war in Sudan, China doesn't do much. There's war in the Middle East, China doesn't do much other than the rhetoric saying, we hope all the warring parties are going to come together to negotiate, hopefully to find peace over here. But I do want to emphasize the Chinese people firmly believe globalization has been beneficial for China, and they want to continuously to embrace globalization. So if you look at the Tsinghua one here, this is across education, across income, they all believe globalization is a good thing. Now, conclusion three is, it's somewhat questionable, but I think we cannot help but drawing this conclusion is Chinese leaders and their people are in sync in their views. We talked about Chinese people have trust in Russia and in North Korea. And here you see the leaders of these three countries are coming together, right? So either the Chinese leaders are making decisions in accordance with the will of the people, or they're doing a great job in getting their people to support their decisions. So my view on this issue is a combination of both. This is a little challenging conclusion, so I do invite questions and challenges from our audience. That is, Taiwan is the most volatile issue. The Taiwan Strait is the most dangerous place on Earth. But military clashes, according to these findings, are most likely to occur either deliberately or by accident in the South China Sea and the Indian-Chinese border. So you see these two pictures, particularly the bottom right is the recent collision between a Chinese naval frigate and a Coast Guard ship, because the Coast Guard cutter was in pursuit of a Filipino ship, but didn't see that the Chinese naval frigate was just nearby. This is where many people, after looking at the findings, think this is the most dangerous place, either by intention or by accident. My final conclusion is, again, related to most of our audience who are here is US-China relationship. How Chinese people view the US will have a huge impact on this relationship. But I think, however Chinese people think about the US, the ball seems to be in the court of US government currently in the next 3 years in the court of Trump. But we don't know where the ball is going to be in the next few more years after Trump leaves the White House. So here are the conclusions. The Chinese people, majority of the Chinese people think the US is the most powerful. Number two, US has an evil plan to contain China's development. Number three, US uses Taiwan to disrupt Beijing's quest to make China great again. I think American politicians, American leaders, American elite, American military industrial complex has played the China card in such a way that each and every time they do something to Taiwan, Beijing gets very nervous. So this is really a trump card, and the Chinese people sees that. For the two countries can set up a perfect G2. I think the Chinese people believe if US and China work together, they can solve all the problems. But the thing is, American people do not think so. American leaders certainly do not think so. Number five, uh, majority of the Chinese people. This is not actually in the finding, but I think this is by my instinct, by guts, and also by looking at just the sheer number of Chinese students in the US.
Well, I think our speaker, Dr. Yawei Liu, lost his connection. Now he's coming back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So here, maybe I have time to go to my last slide. So the last slide, basically, the message from the last slide is you have to look at the findings with some caveat. So here, this is an example of the Alberta survey, 2023 and 2024. So if you look at, I'm not going to go through them individually, is Russia was chosen by many Chinese people to be the country to travel, to work, to study, and even to emigrate. So I think emotionally, uh, the Chinese people are not going to do it. Why do they make such a choice during the survey? Because none of that can be borne by the actual numbers in terms of the number of students in Russia, in
Excuse
terms
me,
of,
Dr. Liu. Can you
yeah,
please share the slides again?
oh, okay,
Yeah, the slides is not on.
okay.
Thank you.
Do you see the slide now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the last slide. What I want to highlight is, so we need to approach the findings, although I have drawn some conclusions with some caveat. That is, some of the findings when we look at these, we have to approach it with different weights. We also have to approach it with the political climate in China. When Chinese people answer the surveys, are they concerned about the big brother watching? Because when Russia enjoys such a high level of confidence, when so many Chinese people say they want to travel to Russia, they want to study in Russia, they want to work in Russia, and they want to even to emigrate to Russia, these views cannot be borne by the facts, and the facts are cold. As I mentioned earlier, U.S. continues to be the destination for Chinese people's investment, for study, and for emigration, period. So I'll stop here, and we have about 15 minutes for questions. So let's have a discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. This was really fascinating. Appreciate you breaking down this data, and we have a whole bunch of questions stacked here. So I think we'll get to it. Really quickly, how did the University of Alberta disseminate their survey?
Disseminate the survey. So the Alberta one, I actually tried very hard to ask for their methodologies. Uh, I don't think I was given complete answer, but if you go to China Institute of University of Alberta survey, they would say it's a combination of online survey as well as cell calls. So it's a combination of both and done by a marketing firm. I think all the surveys I mentioned over here are done by commercial companies. We have to bear in mind to conduct survey in China is very difficult. So most of these surveys are probably conducted by these marketing companies in disguise of this is a marketing research. It has nothing to do with outsiders who want to have a very clear view of what Chinese people think about certain issues. And of course, it's a lot easier to conduct survey on foreign policies rather than on domestic issues.
Thank you. What, in your opinion, or why, in your opinion, does the Chinese public side so strongly with Russia in the Ukraine conflict?
So here, I think, by conventional wisdom, if China pays so much attention to sovereignty issue, so when they talk about Taiwan, when they talk about the maritime, but here is the case of a sovereign country being invaded, and China is very ambivalent and ambiguous, and sometimes offers, clear-cut support to Russian. I think there are multiple causes over here. One of which is the Chinese leaders and maybe the elite to a certain extent are able to convince the Chinese people that this conflict is caused by NATO, and NATO is supported by the United States. This is all big part of that global conspiracy of the U.S., to contain countries that U.S. does not like. So that's one cause. The second, I think, is U.S. and China, our relationship is no good at this point. If U.S. wants China to voice criticism of Russia, then U.S. has to do something to improve this relationship. So they don't think, just to criticize Russia is going to bring the U.S. government around. And thirdly, I think in many of the Chinese people's mind is if eventually there is a war, and we see from the findings, one of which says 46% of the people believe US and China is most likely to get into a war. And in a scenario like that, Russia will play a very important part if there is going to be a Sino-American conflict if Russia sides on the China side. So there may be other reasons, but I think off the bat, these are probably three. But I do want to say many Chinese, at least the international relations scholars, feel very strong China support for Moscow on the war of aggression is wrong, but they don't feel free to share that opinion with other people and publicly.
Thank you. You mentioned in the presentation, Chinese people have a very different view of the US government compared to the US citizens. So why do you think this is? And is it dependent on the administration or consistent no matter who's in power in the US?
Yeah, I think the narrative in China used to be, I talk about the century of humiliation. During that century, US actually was the only country that did not take any inch of Chinese territory. US did not have a sphere of influence in China. US was part of the eight country invasion of China, but US there is the U.S. share of the indemnity, and the U.S. used that money to build universities and hospitals in China, and also to pay Chinese students to study in the U.S. So the feeling, and also, of course, recently we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism, particularly U.S. support to China in China's war of resistance against Japan during the long years of war was crucial. The Flying Tigers, the Doolittle Raiders, the Land Lease, all these things combined to have created a very positive view of Chinese people of the United States. I think, when I said I wrote a dissertation on Mao himself, Mao, I think, loves the United States. He thinks everything in the US is vigorous, is vibrant, that China should learn a whole lot from the US. So I think it's that traditional feeling, even though for the first 30 years, the Chinese government tried very hard to uproot that more positive feeling toward the U.S. With the normalization, with Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping's visit to U.S. In 1979, that view quickly changed. I think the recent negative view of the U.S. This is all toward, I guess from Trump the first and then to Biden and now to Trump the third. It is very clear to the Chinese people that U.S. has a design, and that design is basically to destabilize China, to contain China. But again, the Chinese people don't think the American people share the same feeling. Although, if we make the Gallup or the Pew Research Center findings to the Chinese people, they actually match. 83% of the American people also have very negative view of China. So that, I'm warmed up by that finding that they make the distinction between the Chinese people and the American people. But in any normal case, when people come together, they enjoy each other, they like each other. We're all in the business of people to people diplomacy. I think that's why we need to be more active in getting American people and the Chinese people to come together.
Okay, thank you. What are the key differences between the Japan model and the US model of democracy, and why is Japan's more favorable?
I think Japan is more favorable because if you look at, Japan certainly is a democracy. Japan has the freedom of the media. Japan has the freedom of speech, but politically, it seems to be the Democratic Liberal Party is always in control. I think that's why I think there was, leadership consideration of adopting the Singapore model. But of course, the Japanese model makes more sense is that Singapore doesn't have freedom of the media. Singapore doesn't have freedom of speech. But Singapore and Japan share one thing, at least politically, is one party is forever in power. So I think that's why they think the Japanese model is relevant, more relevant to the China case. If people enjoy peace, economic growth, freedom of speech, they really don't care which party is going to be in power.
So there are kind of two questions here that question the confidence of the polling. And the others was simply, could you comment on what kind of people were included in the poll for Chicago Council survey? So where did this poll get its sample, and how confident are we in the polling results?
So the Carter Center China Pulse survey is, they always have an online sample. And so scholars, particularly Rory Truex from Princeton University, recently wrote an article for the Chinese Leadership Monitor. So for those who want to know more about the quality of the surveys, the concerning factors of these surveys, please go to Chinese Leadership Monitor and read that article. But the Chicago and Carter Center survey, this is a more conventional survey. So there is a random national. Both samples are national, but they're drawn a little bit differently. And also, the Chicago Council and Carter Center survey, it is all through cell phone calls. So you are actually talking to people. And whereas our survey, the China Pulse survey, is online, and one of the concerns is the sampling is national, but this sample is always there, and so much so the people in the sample have become professional survey takers. So that's a very huge factor of concern to the scholars, and as well as to all of us, who really want to have a very accurate grasp of the where Chinese people are in terms of many things we have discussed today.
Thank you. Do you think by sharing this result widely with the American general public, for example, China and US can form a more perfect G2? Can it have some positive influence on how the US people view Chinese people or Chinese government, and then why or why not?
That's a big question. I think US side during the last few years of Obama's second term, they were talking about G2, and the Chinese side was very reluctant. And then later, China got into building, 新型大国关系, the new great power relationship. I think that's the Chinese version of the G2. But by that time, it was too late. Trump was in the White House, and the trade war started, and pandemic changed everything. I think, yes, sharing American poll findings to the Chinese people and sharing our findings, and which we're sharing that right now. It's a little bit difficult to share the Pew Research Center findings and Gallup the Gallup surveys, because at least not through the official media, you're not allowed to talk about it. We put them at U.S.-China Perception Monitor website, but our website is censored all the time by the Chinese censorship regime. So more sharing, more interaction, more tracing the roots of this suspicion of each other. But I believe there are misperceptions on both sides, particularly on the China side, in terms of U.S. is in sharp decline, and on the American side, that China actually want to undermine American political system, that China poses an existential threat to American way of life. These are all misperceptions. These needs to be dispelled. But I do want to say the Chinese view, the Chinese people's view of what U.S. is trying to do to China is totally supported by the presidential decisions, by the congressional resolutions, I think the Chinese people are hoping American people will be able to elect more pro-China leaders into Congress and into the White House, but that's not going to happen. If they see where American people stands on a view of China, that is not going to happen anytime soon. So in the foreseeable future, this relationship will continue to be very difficult to manage.
Well, we are at time, but I really would love to thank you for joining us today. And we have a ton of questions here. We'll share them with you offline. And we really appreciate everything that you shared with us today. So thanks for your fascinating discussion. Also, thanks to all of you for supporting the China Center in this Considering China webinar series. Special thanks to Kai Mei and Joseph Terry for their generous support of the program. And we invite you to help us provide more engaging programming like this with a gift to the China Center. You may do so the link on the webinar announcement or on our website. Please mark your calendars for the next Considering China webinar with Professor Tao Mo Zhou, who is from National University of Singapore on October 23rd. We'll be sending out information about that shortly. We welcome you to join us then and hope you have a good day. Thank you so very much.